Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Ellen France. Our guests today are Abigail Hakas, reporter with Next Generation Newsroom, Kate Huangpu, government reporter with Spotlight PA, and Tom Riese, state capitol reporter with WESA. You guys all wrote about marijuana, and as we all know, this was something that Governor Shapiro wanted. He put in his annual budget address. He wants to legalize adult use marijuana in Pennsylvania. But Tom, you wrote you wrote an article about a bill to increase state oversight for medical marijuana. Can you talk a little bit about what that bill does?
Sure. So Pittsburgh State House member Dan Frankel put forth this bill that would require a little more oversight of medical marijuana products. He said he's learned from other states that some companies that grow cannabis for medical purposes may take part in this thing called lab shopping, which these labs, I should say, totally deny this claim where maybe there's an inflated level of THC, or maybe they're not testing as rigorously for pesticides. And whether or not that's the companies deny that, Rep. Frankel says we should get the medical marijuana program fully buttoned up and improve that it's a safe industry. And maybe that would convince other members of the legislature to be behind fully legal adult use cannabis. He kind of just wants to make sure we have this thing correct and make sure everything's healthy and good to go for patients before we open it up to everyone else.
And Kate, you wrote that pro-marijuana legalization groups are spending $1.6 million on lobbying for this cause. Why do they feel like it is important enough to spend that much money on?
I think currently the medical industry is, hundreds of millions in revenue. With expanding that to the recreational industry, it's potentially hundreds of millions more. So I think a lot of marijuana companies think that there's a lot of money to be made, and that's sort of why they're trying to get their foot in now. CEOs of cannabis companies have said as much, saying that they're excited to see how Pennsylvania develops and explore this new industry. And, in Governor Shapiro's budget plan, he predicted, I think, $500 million in revenue just in the first year. A lot of that is one-time licensing fees, but the projected revenue is in the hundreds of millions for the state, just from taxes. So it stands to reason that there's significant revenue as well for the companies that will be involved in the industry.
Your same article mentioned that some of these pro-marijuana legalization groups donated to campaigns of the current legislatures for the past November 2024 election. Do you think having that donation is going to impact the way that lawmakers vote on this issue?
I would not presume to know lawmakers' minds as a humble journalist. That being said, I think a lot of good government advocates have this exact sort of concern, right? So if the folks who are contributing to lawmakers' campaigns or able to spend money to have lobbyists, have FaceTime with lawmakers on a day-to-day basis, might have outsized voices in issues that the folks spending money are concerned about, right? Whereas everyday folks might not be able to put in that FaceTime or spend that money. So I think there's something to be said about the fact that Pennsylvania doesn't have any spending limits. Pennsylvania is kind of like the Wild West in terms of what kind of money can be spent in politics. And that can lead to a lot of good government folks, everyday folks having concerns about, is this sort of a pay-to-play situation? Is this a situation where if you spend a certain amount, then you get FaceTime, then you get more sway?
Now, Abigail, you wrote about the marijuana transport organizations that transport marijuana across Pennsylvania. What did you learn in doing your research for that article?
Yeah, marijuana transportation is a really interesting industry. So it's coming out of medical marijuana legalization in Pennsylvania. And since cannabis is regulated at the state level, that transportation has to stay within state lines. And each state is setting its own rules. So for example, in Pennsylvania, you have to have 2 drivers in every vehicle. delivery hours are limited from 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., and the products themselves have to be stored in a secure lockbox. And it's a really interesting industry in that it's attracting a lot of retired law enforcement who enjoy that partner culture and enjoy, maintaining the security of a product. And these cultivators, these dispensaries, they're relying on these teams to deliver the product because there is that security concern.
Now, if Pennsylvania were to legalize adult use recreational marijuana, would this harm the transport industry at all?
Not necessarily. I think there's obviously a change in regulation that might happen in how it's transported, but generally these companies are kind of looking towards the future on that. They're hoping that this will bring about an expanded market and perhaps less strict regulation about how they transport, so it works more like how, alcohol or pharmaceuticals are transported.
Tom, you wrote about how Pennsylvania lawmakers have been reacting to some of the things we see happening at the federal level, and you wrote specifically about how Pennsylvania's congressional delegates have responded to President Trump's, quote, Liberation Day last week. What about their responses stood out to you?
So I guess one thing that people might assume, and they would be correct, is that along party lines, people sort of fell. I know that we didn't hear back from Senator Dave McCormick or Senator Fetterman. I believe McCormick had a teletown hall last night, and my colleague Chris Potter covered that. You can find it on our website, how we talked about it. But we did find a podcast where McCormick was talking. I think it was recorded just before Trump's tariff announcement, and it was speaking with a conservative group of hosts and saying, "Hey, like President Trump is seeing the economy as this aircraft carrier, and it's a super heavy thing. It takes a long time to get speed, but we need to be focused on one goal, and we'll eventually get there." So he was basically saying give it more time to sort of ramp up, and some Democrats like Western PA Congressman Chris DeLuzio, who had previously wrote an op-ed saying, not all tariffs are bad. Democrats need to understand that tariffs can be a really valuable tool in terms of getting other countries to beef up their workforce regulations and labor regulations. But the way that the president wants to do this version, we should be opposed to. So probably not that surprising that Republicans were for, or a little more hands off, and Democrats were more outspoken about it.
The Pennsylvania state legislators are trying to make statewide protections for some programs that are being cut federally, one of which involves anti-discriminatory housing. What are state legislators doing to keep that in place in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, there's, I think, on a number of cases, whether that's from the Affordable Care Act and housing to reproductive rights, a group of Senate Democrats last week gathered to say, hey, if there are housing laws that are rolled back, we need to make sure there are protections on the books in Pennsylvania. In particular, they were talking about the Fair Housing Act, which is decades old. They were mostly talking about making sure there's affordable housing in Pennsylvania, that people can still access it, how we would seal eviction records for people while they're still in court. That can make it really hard for people to find other places to rent. And it sounds like they have some bipartisan support. I know one of the proposals, especially specifically on eviction proceedings, had support from a Republican in southwestern PA. But a lot of these proposals, I believe, are not formally introduced in the Senate, so it's hard to know which lawmakers might sign on, or we could see there'd be more bipartisan support there. It seems to be a trend in Harrisburg right now where anything that they feel is at risk at the federal level, they say the state needs to step in now before things change too quickly.
You mentioned the Affordable Care Act, and the Pennsylvania House put together a package of bills to keep aspects of the Affordable Care Act in Pennsylvania. Can you talk about what those bills were?
Yeah, one of them is about pre-existing conditions. One is about making sure young adults up to the age 26 could stay on their parents' medical insurance. They say, if that gets changed at the federal level, and we have a bunch of recent maybe college graduates or people who didn't go to college that are struggling to find work that has these benefits. We need to make sure we keep them safe here. I guess some people would say that would also keep them off of like, state and federally funded programs. So it could also help the state save money that way. Like the Affordable Care Act, I think a lot of people are worried again that if we remove these kind of protections, we could maybe see people going to the emergency departments more often and overcrowding those facilities and potentially hospitals instead of just getting some preventative care.
Do we know where those bills are currently now in the House and also the one in the Senate about housing?
Oh, sure. So a few in the Senate on housing still need to be introduced. I believe the ones on the Affordable Care Act in the House are introduced in committee. Maybe either of you could correct me if I'm wrong. I didn't get to follow them this week. I know the House met, but maybe they got some discussion on the House floor. Unclear on that, though.
I don't think any of them are up for final passage.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, at this point, I think they're like, hey, let's get these out there now. Things are changing pretty quickly since January. But as I'm sure listeners know, things don't move that fast in the state capitol.
Now, Kate and Abigail, you guys both wrote about Pennsylvania's unplugged oil and gas wells. And Abigail, if you could just give us a little background, why are lawmakers concerned about the number of unplugged wells in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I think first thing that's important is there's quite a number of them. Right now, they've identified about 27,000, but really estimates range from, 300,000 to up to 400,000 in some academic research, some suggesting even higher. And there are a lot of public health and safety risks that come from these wells. A lot of them have been unmanaged and essentially decaying for decades. And some things that can happen is, the liquids inside those wells, brine, crude oil, that can seep into water supply, affecting water quality, affecting drinking water. There's also a significant danger from methane that can leak from the well. So methane is an asphyxiant, it's flammable, it can cause explosions, and it's a known climate change contributor. It's almost 30 times as effective as trapping heat in the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So it's quite significant. And the state identifies that about 8% of our methane emissions in Pennsylvania come from those wells. So there's almost no shortage of reasons why the state is pushing to plug those.
Your article included a quote from Senator Gene Yaw, who's the chair of the Senate Environmental Resources and Energy Committee. What did he have to say about Pennsylvania's unplugged wells?
Yeah, he raised some concerns about the amount of money being spent plugging these wells, the costs associated, and the sort of timeline for that happening. He says we should have plugged, at this point, thousands. We've plugged our 300th well a little bit earlier this year. And really, that's coming down to some ways that the funding is distributed and how quickly those contracts have to be fulfilled. And some changes will be coming soon that will hopefully bring about quicker and less expensive well plugging, especially this grant program that's been created to do that on a cheaper scale, about 40,000 for shallower wells, up to 70,000 for more, deep wells.
Now, Kate, you wrote about the federal funding that comes to Pennsylvania for plugging their wells. What is the name of that program? What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, and I would just add for context, I believe in the past decade, we plugged about as many wells as we plugged in last year. So the 200 wells is a relatively significant figure. And part of the reason the money was sort of slow to distribute was because I believe all of it had to be obligated within 90 days of it hitting the bank. So it was sort of like a all at once. The DEP has said, this isn't the usual way that wells get plugged. We had to spend all this money right now. Anyhow, sorry, going back to the question regarding the federal funding, it's under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is where the money is coming from. It's supposed to be doled out, I believe, over the next decade. So we had that $25 million initial grant that was, I believe, 2 years ago. We're supposed to get another $75 million over the next decade or so. And I think the DEP has basically said that, their plan is to obligate these funds. They expect to get these funds, but with what the federal government has been doing with pausing some Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act like programs. They're not completely sure. You can see similar things with other federal funding programs for like green energy or infrastructure grants and programs like the hydrogen hubs. There was an article in Politico that said that parts of that might be paused. One of the programs in Pennsylvania might be cut. So they're sort of just playing it by ear right now.
Did the federal government give a reason as to why they felt it was necessary to cut this funding?
It was sort of wholesale. President Trump did say repeatedly on the campaign trail that he wanted to get rid of the Green New Deal, and the Infrastructure and the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA, they're both sort of parts of the Green New Deal. So I don't believe he's made any specific, or the admin has made any specific comments about these programs, but they sort of wholesale has said, we're going to review what these programs look like. Is there any waste? What do the guidelines look like? Sort of things like that.
Governor Josh Shapiro went to the White House and says that he got the funding back for this program after talking with the Trump administration, but the Trump administration said that they were going to give the funding back prior to meeting with him. Are you familiar with this situation? Can you explain kind of what happened?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, Governor Shapiro has been suing the federal government or filing complaints often with funding that's been delayed, funding that was otherwise obligated. And the impression that advocates, politicians had was that if the money was obligated, then it was pretty much safe. It was already assigned, the federal government can't touch it. But those funds were suspended, both for green energy programs, but also I believe for agriculture. Governor Shapiro just filed another complaint about that. So he's been just interfacing, talking with folks from the federal government about getting those funds flowing. Ultimately, who's to say what the real cause of the funds getting unpaused were, but he did talk to folks in the federal government and now they are unpaused. And the sort of disagreement is the Trump admin said that, their plan was to always unpause them.
Now, Tom, we had a new state legislator sworn in this week. He's from your area of the state, Western Pennsylvania. Can you talk about the special election that elected him and a little bit about him and what he brings to the chamber?
Right. So people probably remember that former state rep Matt Gergely died earlier this year. And in the McKeesport area, the special election was between Dan Gogenauer, who was just sworn in this week, a Democrat who is now a former police detective, and he was a school board member as well, running against a borough council president in White Oak, a Republican named Chuck Davis. I think that seat has been held by Democrats for quite a while, and people weren't expecting an upset like occurred in Lancaster County in the Senate special election race. But when I spoke to Dan while he was still running, he said it was a pretty whirlwind process. Obviously, no one expected the passing of Rep. Gergely, so a lot of things happened very, very quickly. Even the DNC chair, so the national DNC chair, Ken Martin, came out to knock on doors with Gogenauer. So they gave a little bit more special attention there when maybe people thought it would just be, a kind of quiet affair, expecting Democrats to win there. So now Democrats again have the majority in the House just by one seat. And while it wasn't covering the state legislature during prior special election times, I know that the tied House deadlocked action for quite a while, and state House members are celebrating this bipartisan sort of understanding that, hey, we need to get things done regardless. So we have seen action in the past few months instead of there just being a pause.
Abigail, you wrote about the lottery wanting to sell more big prize tickets. Can you explain why they want to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, some important context for this, all of the lottery's profit goes to programs benefiting senior citizens in Pennsylvania. So, that's stuff like property tax and rent rebates, low cost prescriptions, reduced fare for bus rides. And the lottery wants to spend more of its annual revenue on payouts, especially for its higher cost, higher payout games like the very popular $30 and $50 scratch offs. They're hoping to attract a larger crowd of customers, bringing in more money, but they're held back by a 20% profit requirement. So they're essentially forced to set aside 20% of profit from traditional games so that it goes straight to senior programs. Now, their sort of argument to this is a little bit complicated, but essentially they're just arguing it's a smaller slice of a bigger pie if they do this. The lottery will have more profit overall. And so even though it might be less than 20% of the annual revenue, it'll still be more money than it would be otherwise.
What concerns are there for increasing the lottery prize amounts?
I think the concern is just a general concern over the lottery and over gambling. The idea that attracting more customers and getting more people to play potentially more often will increase the number of gambling related harms that people might face. There's concern over an increase in gambling addiction.
Kate, you wrote about a bill that was recently proposed to loosen the education requirements for people who work with day care for older adults in Pennsylvania. And why was this legislation introduced?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's because there's a healthcare worker shortage in Pennsylvania. Our population is getting older. We're a graying state, so folks are getting older faster, or there's a greater percentage of people getting older. Um, and there are sort of various solutions trying to be introduced or floated to solve that issue. A lot of home care workers and advocates for home care workers say, the best solution is to pay us more. That's the most direct solution. Um, so some folks want to raise the amount that home care workers can be reimbursed through Medicare. We do have like a relatively lower rate. So I believe ours is about $20 and change, whereas a lot of our neighboring states are around the $25 mark. But this solution in particular is part of a package of bills that's meant to just make it easier for folks to get into home care, to see if the industry works for them. I believe one of the other bills was to allow high school students to get credit for working in direct care. The other one, I believe, was to speed up the nursing education process. But so this bill, I believe, was part of a package that was also introduced last session. A few of the bills passed last session. It just has never made it to the House, or the House hasn't acted on it.
What are the current requirements to work in this field in Pennsylvania?
The GED, for one, GED or high school diploma. I believe you have to be 18 years of age. If you're under that age, then you can work in the field, but there are more restrictions. Can't have any sort of illnesses. There's sort of a specific illness component where you have to be physically able to perform the task. Part of that includes having no issues with addiction. I believe those are the big ones that come to mind.
And what have the workforce for this career path, the older adult care industry, what have they said about these new requirements?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this bill, what they've said is, potentially they're interested in what this could be. They're sort of not sure. They'd want to make sure that it doesn't impact the quality of care. So the advocates that I talked to either had sort of no formal position or have said they're tentatively interested. But by and large, what I heard was, the most clear-cut solution would be to pay folks more. That incentivizes more folks to work in the industry, to stay in the industry, so there's less turnover, and that sort of is top of mind for them. I think that's a part of the budget as well. There's sort of an allocation for folks that work in home care, and a lot of advocates are saying, we got to up that number.
Now, lastly, we only have a couple minutes left. Abigail, you wrote about an art project that each county is doing to commemorate America's 250th birthday next year. Can you talk about a little bit of what this project is?
Yeah, so the Bells Across PA project is a collaboration with local artists. So every county can place a bell or even multiple bells. They're expecting about 100 across Pennsylvania. And these bells are designed in collaboration with those local artists, and they're put typically in places of historical significance for the county ahead of the United States 250th anniversary next year.
Is there a significance as to why they chose bells for this art project? They could have chosen anything. Why did they choose bells?
Yeah, so the bells themselves are Liberty Bell replicas, and they're actually quite large. They're 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide, I believe, and they're made of fiberglass. So they're pretty significant bells, but it's, a nod to Pennsylvania's role in the history of the United States.
All right, in the last couple minutes, can you guys go through what articles you guys are working on that our viewers can catch posted in the next couple of weeks? We'll start with you, Tom.
Sure. I think one just posted this morning, and we'll definitely be. I'll be hoping to follow up with it on our colleague who works on healthcare. There was a House bill that aimed to create a medical debt relief program, and yesterday in the House Health Committee, an amendment was announced to say, "Hey, this might not be as feasible." To do that, I think there was pushback last session about it, and they weren't sure where the funds would come from to purchase medical debt and wipe it out. So now it's going to focus on transparency in hospital and health system financial aid. I believe most, if not all, hospitals and health systems have this, especially the nonprofits. And State Rep Arvind Venkat, who is an emergency physician, said, "Hey, even as a clinician, like I'm not exactly sure what's in these sort of financial aid packages. So we want to make all of the hospitals give us that info. We'll put it on a state site and make sure everyone has access to it to prevent medical debt instead of maybe wiping out past debt." Some patient advocates or caregiving advocates said that, like, hey, it would have been great to keep this in there, but this is still, this is still progress that they were happy to see despite that change.
Kate, what are you working on?
Yeah, a few things. I'm working on a story about Pennsylvania being one of the, I think, 10 states that has completely closed primaries. So independents, folks that aren't registered with the party, can't vote. That locks out, I believe, like 1.3, 1.4 million voters. It's sort of been a perennial effort to change that system. I'm working on a story about the new adequacy funds and school districts that have received that funding, what they've done with it, sort of things like that. And then always just looking out for budget, nuggets as that season approaches.
And lastly, Abigail, what are you working on?
Yeah, you can find all of my work on nextgenerationnewsroom.com. So far, I've really been focused on Allegheny National Forest in the recent weeks. There's been a sort of a call for increased logging, and there's been a lot of changes at the federal level to make that happen. So I'll have a story coming out likely today on the impacts on the forest environmentally. I've also been covering the NFL draft, which will be coming to Pittsburgh next year, covering a lot of the sort of financial agreements with the NFL. I'll have a story that's comparing how Pittsburgh is prepping for the draft with how Green Bay's been prepping for it this year and Detroit did for last year. And then I'm also going to be covering maternal mortality and health. So the state is preparing a strategic plan to address concerns over maternal health care and maternal mortality. So I'll be sort of covering what's happening there statewide.
All right. Our guests have been Abigail Hakas, reporter with Next Generation Newsroom, Huangpu, government reporter with Spotlight PA, and Tom Riese, state capitol reporter with WESA. Thanks, everyone. That's it for Journalist Roundtable. I'm Ellen Frantz. Thanks for watching.